Good afternoon, and welcome to each of you to Collegeville Connections, an online series presented by the Collegeville Institute located on the campus of St. John's University in Abbey in Collegeville, Minnesota. Collegeville Connections highlights the work of Collegeville Institute alums and friends from across the spectrum of Collegeville Institute programs. It provides an opportunity for new guests, program alums, and friends to stay connected to each other and to the Collegeville Institute. But most importantly, you will learn a lot about and from our remarkable guests. I'm Carla Durand. I'm on staff at the Collegeville Institute, and I have the privilege and the pleasure of introducing today's guest speakers. But before I get to that, I'll say just a few words about the tech side of things, and we'll share with you what we need to know about logistics. We are streaming this presentation on two platforms, both Facebook Live and Zoom. We hope to have some time for questions and comments at the end of the presentation. So if you are on Zoom, please add your questions or comments into the Q&A function. And if you are on Facebook Live, please add your comments or questions into the feed. We have extra staff members on hand receiving those questions, and they'll direct them into the right hands. And if you happen to lose your connection over Zoom, you can switch over to Facebook Live and continue streaming from there. So with those few points of logistics, we'll be on to our presentation and to our presenters. We are delighted today to be joined for a conversation about faith and music, and maybe a few enjoyable and surprising stories with Don Saliers and Emily Saliers and our moderator, Bill Cahoy. Dr. Bill Cahoy is former professor of theology and Dean Emeritus of St. John's School of Theology and Seminary, and he is currently the chair of the board of directors of the Collegeville Institute. Dr. Don Saliers is currently Theologian-in-Residence at Candler School of Theology after retiring in 2007 as the William R. Cannon Distinguished Professor of Theology and Worship. For many years, he directed the Master of Sacred Music program at Emory University and was an organist and choir master at Cannon Chapel for 35 years. Before joining the Candler faculty in 1974, Don taught at Yale Divinity School. He also taught many summers and a few semesters during the academic year at St. John's School of Theology and Seminary, where he and Bill Cahoy were colleagues. Their friendship goes back to Don's first stay at the Collegeville Institute as a resident scholar in 1972, when Bill was an undergrad at St. John's thinking about grad school. Emily Saliers is an American singer-songwriter and member of the musical duo Indigo Girls. Emily plays lead guitar as well as banjo, piano, mandolin, ukulele, bouzouki, and many other instruments. During the fall of 1977, Don and his wife Jane loaded up their 4 daughters, including Emily, into their car, traveled halfway across the country, and spent that academic year in residence at the Collegeville Institute, where Don served as a resident scholar. And so with those brief introductions, I'll turn things over to Bill.
Oh, welcome. Thank you, Carla. Appreciate that. It's wonderful to see Don and Emily here, have you with us. It's been too long, especially Don. We used to get together fairly regularly, and now it's been a few years. And Emily, I've seen you mostly on stage, but I remember once outside my office when you were visiting your dad. But as Carla mentioned, 4 kids, 4 daughters, mom and dad, in a 3-bedroom apartment for a year at the Collegeville Institute. What was that like?
Well, that was the year of the children at Collegeville. There were 10 or maybe 11. We're trying to remember if there was an infant as well. And so one of the things that Emily might want to talk about is the friendships that she developed there. And it was a musical year because these kids were always jamming at the center or somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, I actually met my friend Rose Nielsen because Harry Nielsen was there that year, and she and I became best friends, and we were soul sisters. And she lives in Canada with her husband, so I don't get to see her that much, but we've remained friends throughout our lives. But there was always something going on. I mean, if I had to describe that year, in my memory, it was quite exotic because we came from Georgia. I was in high school. It started snowing in October. It snowed through April. The pond out back of the Ecumenical Center froze. So, you know, bumps and all, we got to just skate in our backyards. And there was always music because most of the kids were musical, my family, the Nielsen's and others. So we had our own little talent shows and things like that. So it was full of, and then I sang in the choir at Apollo High School, and it was just, and so did Rose. It was just full of music and life and the weather. You know, we used to want to chew gum on the way to the bus stop because the bubbles would freeze as hard as rocks, and we had to plug our car in, and it was just stuff that for a kid from Georgia was quite exotic. And all my memories are so vivid from that year, the people we met, and Sister Dolores and all the brothers from the community. Just
Oh,
Father
that's
Wil-
wonderful.
Father Wilfred,
And
Father
of course,
Godfrey.
yeah, Father Godfrey and the watercress and the mushroom. And of course, Father Killian, you know,
Yeah.
whom we celebrate his 100th birthday this year. So wonderful. And
Yeah.
Em got her professional musical start in St. Cloud. You should say about that.
Yeah, it was my first musical gig, and I played and sang at a restaurant called the Ground Round in St. Cloud. So if anyone ever asks me where I first played professionally, I can proudly claim it was in St. Cloud, Minnesota.
All right. Just see for all those people watching what the Collegeville Institute can do for you and your family. It's great. This could be you. Well, thanks. I know lots more stories, and maybe we'll get to a few of them along the way. But our topic is faith in music, as Carla said, or more specifically, as we put in the announcement, spirituality, song, and social justice. So it's hard to tackle three categories at once. So I thought we'd start with spirituality and song, or faith and music. What does this mean to each of you?
Well, I think the first thing that needs to be said is that we're singing together again in public. I know a lot of the churches are cautious about this, but for me as a liturgist and musician, the fact that we're having assembly singing again, and Emily can talk a little bit about what it's like for her again and Amy to be on concerts. But I think what has happened is that some people forgot what the depth of singing together is. And I could say right away, that's a spiritual act, is to be singing together in company, in community. So for me, of course, as a liturgical musician, we're working our way back into the enormous gift of what it is to sing good poetry together and the liturgy of sorts. But Emily, you're back on the road. I mean, you should say a word or two about the quality of what it is to have 10,000 people at Ravinia in Chicago.
Well, I think, you know, we may have taken what singing together and what live music, the actual spiritual force and healing force that is, because during the pandemic, it was completely shut down. And a lot of people, their spirits, the lights in their spirits were dimmed. And I know this from our own experience, because as soon as we had to cancel shows, we immediately started doing live streams, kind of like this, although Amy and we played songs and so we were able to keep the community together. But it was nothing like when we finally got out, and Amy and I would step on stage, and I would just feel enveloped by the energy of the love for sharing live music again. It's very, very powerful. And even in their masks, you know, the audience, I'd say, this is great. We're singing together in masks, and it hasn't, like, it's as powerful as it's ever been, and maybe even more so because we appreciated it so much. But going back to faith and music, I mean, we grew up going to church. The hymns are in my body in a cellular level. What I learned in church choir, singing descant and things like that, working together to create something beautiful, not only deep into my spiritual life, but then it led exactly to what Amy and I did together. And then ultimately we'll get to music and justice, but it's all intertwined. There's a confluence of music and faith and activism and all those things. And it started very young, and it started in church with the hymns and what we sang in choir.
Wonderful.
And
Yeah.
for me, I have body memory of singing the Psalms with the community at St. John's, morning prayer and evening prayer and at the Eucharist. And also the difference between the women at St. Ben's chanting the Psalms and the men of St. John's. Those are indelible spiritual resources for me. And I happen to be right now writing a book on a theological commentary on the Psalms. And there are times when my intellectual side dims under the prospect of trying to handle all that. So I go back to the singing of the Psalms. And when I need inspiration, I will simply sing one of those psalm tones from St. John's. And also the immense, some of your hearers may remember when Jerome Collar and there were special compositions for Vespers. Those musical compositions of the Psalms for the night office or the morning or the offices that we sing also are part of this mix in me. So I have no doubt that the question of music is intimately connected with the question of spirituality, coming alive to the world, coming alive to transcendence, awe and wonder and beauty and humor. Something about singing the Psalms, you come to the office and it's kind of like, wait till tomorrow, we'll pick this up again, And so it's singing over time. It's that cumulative effect of the gift of music. So that would be in my own definition of the spirituality.
That's wonderful. I know being part of those prayers, morning prayer and evening prayer, I spent a better part of my life here at St. John's, and it gives me goosebumps when I pause and think people like this have been gathering for over 1,500 years without interruption, singing these same songs on this cycle, nourishing them. I mean, it's beautiful. Yeah, talk about being part of a long community that's very moving.
And hearing things you didn't think you had heard before. I mean, that's the thing, is that the cycle recurs and your life changes, but the Psalms come back to your life. I mean, sometimes I think the question of spirituality is, can we grow up enough to receive the gift of music?
Wow.
I think it applies to all societies now. We'll get into this into the justice issue, but what happens when a community stops singing together? What happens when a society doesn't listen to the musical treasures that has been given, either Saturday night or Sunday morning? We'll come back.
Yeah.
I'm sure.
Now, talk about that a bit. I know you've done these performances together. You did a book together, A Song to Sing, A Life to Live, just that connection of singing and living, reflections on music as a spiritual practice, to pick up from this. But so you did a book together and you've done these, I want to call them performances. It's not quite a concert for people who haven't seen them, because there'd be extended commentary with the music. I think I've heard you guys 4 times. Everyone was fabulous. But the Saturday night, Sunday morning, what does that mean to you two? And why did you start doing these concerts?
Well, we had written an article together for a publication, and then we were invited to write this book. And as Dad often says, this is a long conversation between Dad and me. And, Amy and I were essentially a bar band when we first started playing professionally. And of course, Dad is a church musician. And so we started talking about the crossover between what happens in a community when people come to sing together. Because this bar that we played at all the time was a motley crew of people. And it was people from the musicians that represented different genres, and people were troubled, and we came together, and it was like, I don't want to, overuse the word church in this context, because that happens sometimes, but it was truly a gathering of spirits, and we all lifted each other up, and sharing music was the commonality and the spiritual glue, because it kept us happy and together, and it allowed us to lament the things that were troubling us. And so Dad, being a church musician, we wanted to sit down and talk about the power of music in a so-called secular setting and a so-called sacred setting. And Dad grew up cutting his teeth on jazz. He was this close to being a Saturday night musician, I would say, until he got called. So we just started by, over coffee, lots and lots of cups of coffee over time, talking about where are the intersections of Saturday night and Sunday morning.
And of course, that prompted me, as some of you who are musicians who may be listening in, I mean, you know full well that there's a thin line between music that's in a culture and that gets incorporated into liturgical music. I mean, and some of our greatest composers have this wonderful amphibious quality, a polyphonic, if you will. So this is where the connection is made. And if we think of one genre only, just the spirituals, there we have that connection that is so profound. I mean, grieving together and lamenting together and praising together, that we associate with a number of types of music, but I think especially of the spirituals. And they hover and always are feeding both sides of the Saturday night and Sunday morning. It's hardly a dichotomy for me anymore, although the church has always had its struggle. And Catholic Church has had its struggle with what music shall we borrow? Praise. I mean, that's a long history in itself. We won't get into that, but I do think that this question of how we hear the world, how do we sing our life in the world together, is that commonality in there. And then there will be disputes about what's appropriate for this and what's appropriate. Yeah. But I think this long conversation that Emily refers to, what resulted in that article, in that book, and then, for example, a recent time we had in Minneapolis was at a Lutheran parish there that became a signal part of the protests after the death of, after these deaths, especially. There's a pastor there, Rasmussen is her name, and she became celebrated on television. Well, Emily and I did a concert on, and then we did a seminar on themes of justice. We're already.
Yeah, we'll get to that in just a minute, right?
So, and of course, one of the things I keep loving to talk about is how many of the Indigo Girls songs are oriented toward things I wish people in church would talk about.
Yeah.
So sometimes our concerts are connected with real conversations about questions of not only justice, but spirituality in community. And I remember that particular combination of musical singing and then a conversation with the conversation that came on these topics. It was a kind of a seminar on social justice. So they were
well, as you mentioned, the disputes about what to borrow. I think of, you could name some, but hymns that are actually built on folk songs that were, but I think of that as significant in itself, to be sure. And I don't want to get sidetracked on this, but I don't want to lose track of it. It's a metaphor for my understanding of the Christian life generally, in the sense of we're always figuring out what to borrow from the world around us, what can be sanctified, and what will lead us astray. And we don't withdraw, we don't have everything separate, but we also don't just totally go with whatever the world says is good. And figuring that out is a challenge in every generation. And you folks embody that around music in a great way. So
Sometimes,
think, oh, Emily, please.
I was just gonna say, sometimes the questions and the answers are quite simple. Does this that we're borrowing enhance human dignity? Is it about listening to stories, and through the hearing of our stories, we are healed? I know that Amy, she wrote a song called Rise of the Black Messiah, and Herman Wallace, who was incarcerated, and they let him out of prison, and he died very shortly after that from cancer, but he wrote Amy a letter, and he's like, this is my story and please tell it. And she wrote this song. And so there's like the sharing of stories. And for someone from the outside might say, well, a letter from a man in prison, that's not something that we should borrow as part of our spiritual canon, or but in fact it is. So you have to this is one thing that the church cannot avoid: the nitty gritty of life, the racism, the struggle, the oppression. And if you ask a simple question like, does this stand for human dignity and justice and love among us? Then I think it's not so difficult to sort out, what belongs in the realm of the spiritual and what doesn't.
And I'm sure there are people listening who are having a kind of, oy vey.
Yeah.
Patmos was a prisoner. I mean, and Paul and Silas. I mean, this whole question, the letter from the Birmingham jail. It's not unprecedented that the church's music should be expressive of the anguish and the justice and the passion and the awe and wonder of human life under God, singing from circumstances. So I think that thing is really important, really important.
And maybe that if you stand for those things, you may end up incarcerated. And that's the world too. Yeah. So let's talk about justice. Bring that in. I recently, and kind of related to the concerts too, but I heard an interview with Bruce Springsteen and Barack Obama. They have this book out, and they're going around doing those. It was actually quite interesting. But Springsteen said at one point, I want to be sure I get this right, something that sounds a lot like what you were saying, Amy, that at one point he realized that his concerts, quote, create a space of common values and shared narrative. Well, that sounds a lot like what liturgy should be doing. But that experience of bringing these people together and then celebrating those common values, perhaps, maybe discovering them. But it sort of, in some ways, creates a community. He used that term later. Is that your experience, Amy, with your concerts? Could you just expand on that a little bit? You suggested it earlier, but expand on that a little.
Well,
or Emily, I'm sorry.
That's okay. We call our group of listeners our community because, for instance, when we did some of these live streams, we wanted to raise money for different groups that were really in need, like the Dene Navajo community out in the Southwest, and Indian communities that have been way underserved, especially during the pandemic, and health services. And then we also wanted to raise money for a food group in Southwest Georgia, Feeding the Valley, that Stacey Abrams made us aware of. And, in the height of the pandemic, when times were tough for people, they dug into their pockets and we sang songs and we talked about these issues, and they chipped in and they listened, like thousands of people on these live streams. And so it was a real sense of community. It was like, here are the stories of some of these people who are underserved or need to be heard, and we need to join together as a community to help each other out. And then our listeners, they're just like that. They come together. And also, I was going to mention, there is a song that Amy wrote called Let It Ring. And, it's about queer rights and validity of the queer life and experience. And she sings, I get down on my knees and I pray just like you do. And I know that Jesus loves me too. And the outpouring of verbal emotion when she hits those lines, it's like we have a community of people who have experienced the pain of being ostracized because of their sexuality, but also the joining in of our allies in the community who are like, yes, thank you for telling the story, we're with you. So I wouldn't call it anything less than a community of people. And we're all we may have some differences. We may not share all the same values, but there's enough commonality and there's music to galvanize the commonality. And that's where the two things come together, the music and the justice.
What you remind me of here is without lament and doxology, which properly belong to the Christian church and liturgy and Jewish liturgy and church and so on, without the rhythms of lament, lamentation, and doxology, there won't be a taste for justice. I think justice requires our full participation in the deep sorrow and the tragic and the oppressive, and to say a word of truth and to sing a word of truth about that. And then the reverse is doxology. That is to say, this notion of thanksgiving and praise that issues once you've told the truth and hear it and have a community to sing that and live that together. So in some ways, this is now my theological overlay on this account, which I believe profoundly. A community that has access to the full range of the lamentable and the praiseworthy really does understand then what the real sources of justice are. And so that's why I think that justice requires being stretched out between lamentation and doxology.
Wonderful. I suppose the problem is, on the one hand, if you have just doxology, you're naive or oblivious to the suffering. But if you have just lament, you get overwhelmed by the suffering and can't act. And you find, that's a wonderful image.
You must be a theologian. That's beautifully said.
I try. I had good teachers.
But this is what our conversation is often about. The rediscovery of that principle that we must tell the truth. I've often thought that there are three forms of truth telling. One is lament, genuine lament. But the second is confession. What's going on in us? Our complicities and so on. But the third form of truth telling is let it all hang out in praise. Let it all hang out in thanksgiving. And those three, I think, require each other. And I think, from me, as the liturgical point of view, those are required of the church. And what I see and what Emily says and experiences and does, those things are going on in people's lives. And music has to connect with that somehow over time.
So as you think about this and your experiences, an increasing number of people are not finding that in their experience of church.
Right.
And they seem to be finding it in some way in their musical experiences, or art, other kinds of art too. What's missing, do you think, in the church experience that might be available from other things? I mean, Emily, what's your take on that?
I have a couple thoughts that come to mind. One is the language of worship, some of the language of hymns, pronouns, use of pronouns. And of course, depending on the congregation, like there are some church experiences. I grew up in a very progressive experience and a very ecumenical experience. But for people who aren't getting what they need to grow spiritually in church, I think the language, all the he's and the Father Gods and the almost like a patriarchal expression of the word alienates people. I think when God is thought of as this power that can take vengeance on people for doing wrong, what I think people need is more of the spirit of God that they can feel in the struggle of their daily lives. I think that people are it is much more people, they want to be spoken to, not as something from on high, but something that we can all relate to. It's sort of like a relativity that may just be cultural, postmodern, whatever you want to call it. but I think that people need to have the Spirit speak through them and in their lives, and structurally and patriarchally. And also, if you think about even what's going on in the Methodist Church, with when the conference comes together and all the conservative factions are like, you cannot ordain gay people, this is not compatible with the teachings of Christ. Well, everybody I know is like, why do you even associate with that church anymore? That's ridiculous. That you can't, you may have to throw out the baby with the bathwater, you know, because that's just plain wrong. And people feel a lot of alienation from, and in the Catholic Church, you know, incredible hope.
Yeah.
And yet some of the restrictions within the way the Catholic Church is set up is just, they just completely alienate people. They alienate women, they alienate queers, and that's a large part of it.
Yeah.
There you have it. You've heard of Amos, you've heard of Hosea. This is Emily. Thank you very much.
Yeah, right. This is good.
I
Preach
just-
it, sister.
Tell me, I just listen to what people tell me.
Well, here I am. I keep running good bath water and good bath salts. And so I want the baby to be clean, bathed. So I'm not trying to preserve the old bath water. I love that expression too. But I think the baby is important. Now, the plain point of the matter is, for me, looking at the church and its worship, is that a lot of the church's worship suffers from, let's put it this way, a word that doesn't connect. Homilies that just don't go anywhere, that are full of sort of little, I don't know, tidbits of advice and so on. Nothing about life and death and justice, and nothing about the huge hope for the entire creation. Now, that's changing. I can say, I know parish churches, Catholic and Protestant, that have a lively word and that are not self-indulgent words. On the other hand, for me, the notion of sacramentality is absolutely crucial to rediscover. Now, I could get into some technical vocabulary. Mystagogy, where did mystagogy go in the church? I would love to see a church that does really good mystagogy. And
Tell us what that means, Don.
Okay, that means unpacking the experiences that you have that are experiences of transcendence and love. So, I mean, when St. Augustine and Ambrose, his teacher, got together in Milan, mystagogy was really crucial. And so that's a technical word. I don't want to bore you with that, but it's like this in American culture. We have a lot of experiences. We say, wow, that was a great experience. And then you ask someone, well, what was the experience like? Well, I don't know. It was just a great experience. Mystagogy tries to unpack the content of what we experienced of awe and joy and sorrow and thanks and joy. You know, I think some of it goes back just to these basic teachings like weep with those who weep and rejoice with those who rejoice. Who said that? Well, turns out to be Jesus. Well, a lot of people have just blanked on that one. And so what I see, I look for churches that reconnect liturgy with their actual ministries in the world, with how they distribute food and clothing and how they love one another and how they address the ills of society, and that the liturgy is vibrating with that because it's biblical. So I've got my frame here. I mean, I've got my prejudices.
Yeah, well, it's the shared narrative.
Yeah.
So
it's shared
with that idea of mystagogy and unpacking the experience, Emily, when I think about the concerts,
narrative.
and maybe it's kind of those things that you guys did together, those performances, Saturday night, Sunday morning. It seems to me music, you could make a case that music is both the experience, the powerful, emotional experience. But I got the idea from the way you were talking about it, it's also something of the mystagogy. You also try to unpack maybe in the lyrics and different things, But where is that unpacking for that experience people have at your concerts? How would that happen? What's the meaning of these events?
Well, I
That's a
mean,
good
what-
question.
it is a very, very good question. And I know because of social media, I know because of what the communities say to one another after the concerts. They also start their own communities and they talk to each other and they talk about what songs have meant to them. We get a lot of correspondence about a particular song and how it helped them through a very, very difficult time in their lives. We've actually had people say, your music literally saved me.
Yeah.
And
Mm.
I don't claim the power of our music because everything comes from something that came before it. I mean, I just believe in the continuum of music and spirituality and healing and community. But that's where some of the unpacking happens, is what people talk about. And it just, I think that you don't necessarily have to unpack joy. If you are singing together and everybody is singing, a lot of times we'll say like, do y'all want to sing this verse? And they'll take the third verse or they'll take this part of the song and everybody's singing at the top of their lungs. And there is a cellular shift that is happening where people are, and I'm always, I mean, Dad, you sometimes call me not a mystic, mystical. I'm into mysticism. I'm not a mystic,
No.
but I believe in that. I believe in sort of the things that, well, transcendence, things that cannot be explained in the physical universe, the intersection between the physical world, the energetic world, and the spiritual world, and how that happens. I'll just share this. I'm in recovery. I'm about to pick up my 10-year chip this month.
Hey, wonderful.
Part of the-
Congratulations.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Part of the miracle of AA is that because alcoholism is a brain disease, it's something that happens in your body. You're not a loser if you're an alcoholic. You have this thing. But the healing of that thing comes from a spiritual solution. And so the integration of the physical world, the dysfunction,
Mhm.
and the spiritual healing answer to that as a way to live, that speaks everything to me about what gets unpacked when people sing together. So you have the physical experience,
Yeah.
and then the mystical experience.
No, I'm very impressed with that. In fact, sometimes when I'm out doing talks about liturgy and faith and the church's current travail, I so often, my father was an alcoholic, so I knew at an early age the power of AA and its practices. And the point is the church sometimes could use a little bit of more than a little of the practices of AA. And I think they are intrinsically spiritual. I think Emily and I have talked about this.
Mhm.
So one of my thoughts is that we can learn a lot in the church's own sensibility from these practices, from healing communities outside the church, and that's certainly one of them.
And I will say that I rarely mention AA because it's not about personalities,
right.
and no
Yeah.
one can claim that they've got this thing settled and they represent AA. No one can do that, and least of all me. But what it was is just a way to describe when the spiritual and the physical world come together, and that's how I've experienced it.
Well, church people can be like that too,
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
right? Oh, if that's Christian, I guess I'm going to hold back. Yeah, right.
Yeah. No.
So when you think about these experiences, then the spiritual and the mystical and the practices, I think about, and what you were just saying about music, to connect this to social justice, because on both spiritual, the life of faith, music, there's a certain way it can all be about, I want an experience. I get the experience. I went to the opera. I'm overwhelmed. I'm done. But what you're talking about is a connection of this to action promoting justice. What can we do to help facilitate that that connection? And you talked about the social media and so on, but on both sides, maybe what have you learned from this about how we might do more to move from powerful experiences in church or at a concert to lives that work for justice? Teach us.
Yeah, well, the first thing to say is that love's a fire, but it also has to take out the garbage. And I think any good relationship, married relationship and so on, or deep friendships, has to understand that. I keep thinking of one of your earliest songs that became one of the great early hits, Hammer and a Nail. We got to ask the question, do we want a rose or not? Do we want to have do we want to have a community that celebrates the just and the good, or not? Do we want beauty or do we want despair? And those fundamental questions have to be asked in the church. And that was part of my experience of that time we had in Minneapolis at her church. And then lo and behold, about a year later, they were faced with the question of riots and how the church could help. And so suddenly they were a frontline place where you could go. And so I think one of the not only all, but just one of the things I keep thinking about is, can we make palpable what we sing and pray? Is it possible to, and this is so Benedictine that I'm laughing at myself here. Ora et labora, says Saint Benedict. What did he mean by that? Well, at times, clearly, if you read the rule and you hang around some Benedictines, you realize that their labora is their aura, and their aura is their labora. And
Aura meaning prayer, labora meaning work. Right.
I'm sure all your hearers know this, but anyway, yeah, work and pray and work. They are two sides of the same reality, the human response to the transcendent call. And Emily, I love Emily's emphasis on the third person of the Trinity. She wouldn't put it this way. She keeps talking about spirit. And the neglected person of the Trinity.
Yes.
The church, now I'm not talking about raw Pentecostalism, though they got something to teach us.
Mm-hmm.
I'm talking about what it is when you discern the work of the Spirit with your hands, hammer and a nail. I've often thought that should be the theme song for Habitat for Humanity. So contained in that song, I think, is part of the image, at least I have, of an answer to your question.
Yeah.
I think it's an important point. Dad mentioned like a marriage. I mean, there is a responsibility and there is a relationship. And I, when I grew up going to church at the benediction, it was like, go out into the world, but I didn't go to one church service and then that was it. I took 6 months off and I was raring to go for the rest of my life. It was to go back and experience again and again, whether it's your meeting or your church or and you have to honor the relationship of the work, like Dad was saying, that it takes to do work in the world. And also there's a way to work at designing a liturgy, a worship service. I mean, we've talked, this is what Dad does, so that it's not just planned, but thought about so that it can move people. You don't just slap it together in the same way that if you're going to have a benefit or do a tour with a social action, it has to be planned. So there's work that goes into, you have a responsibility to make sure it's not just like, oh, we're going to do this here and it'll all work out. So I really appreciate the discipline, the responsibility, and the work that's involved in social justice work.
Yeah, and
That's fascinating.
Where do you get?
So you're designing liturgies in your concerts and you do social follow-up. Emily, when you mentioned social media, do you do social media connections by design related to your concerts, or that kind of happens on its own?
It was promotional things.
Okay.
Social media is a necessary tool now. Personally, I don't have a Facebook account. I just can't, it's overwhelming to me. Everybody from everybody's past reaching out, wanting to reconnect is just like, whoa.
I don't either.
Too many people, too much noise. But we use Facebooks and, TikTok and all the things to promote shows, and also to advertise if we're doing, say, a concert for Honor the Earth, which is a group we started with Winola the Duke. There's big pipeline issues in y'all's neck of the woods.
Yeah.
And indigenous peoples are fighting these pipelines that are unnecessary, that are desecration of their sacred lands, threaten water and ecosystems. And this is something that the church and some churches do need to be speaking about, is the relationship between spirituality and the earth. Because they don't, the indigenous peoples I know, who they pray to the creator, they don't have a dogma, a creed, or any of that. I'm not discounting the importance of that in other contexts. But I'm saying for them, it's a recognition of we are all tied to the earth, to all the creatures, and we pray and give thanks to the creator. And also those activists, they are worn down. And when they get worn down, they dance and they sing. They bring music in, they beat the drums, they lift their spirits through music. Because it's really tough for those people, especially in the Midwest right now, fighting those pipelines.
Yeah.
So
This is something I've learned from the Indigo Girls and from Emily and from others too, but especially your commitments to your work with Indigenous peoples. And I mean, time would fail us if I started telling what I've learned from the stories she's told about Chiapas, Mexico, Vieques, I mean, all kinds of things like that. But the main point I want to make is that these people have rituals that embody narratives that give them a pattern of life.
Right.
And if the church forgets that at the heart of word and sacrament is a ritual that keeps presenting the truth, if we forget that and dim it down and domesticate it and make it ho hum, what else is new? Oh, I might go to church, might not. By the way, it's an interesting phenomenon to discuss. That's another seminar you could sponsor. And that is the impact of watching church on television, on Zoom, and church shopping and so on.
Yeah.
For good or for ill. Anyway, that's a side topic. The main thing I wanted to say is that rituals embody not only images of life, but narratives of how to live into the mysteries of being human. And that's what I often get from the stories Emily has told about their musical encounters, and particularly, I think, work with people on the ground, the Americas, here in Georgia, and especially the indigenous peoples. I have benefited from the spiritual work that they're doing as musicians. And then I asked the question that I think you're asking us too, or asking the church. How can the church recover that? How do we get in on that? It seems to be, if we want to talk about a word indigenous, that's indigenous to what the church is about. And what if you forfeit? What if you forfeit for a cliche your whole darn life?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, what I hear from both of you is that intentional passion for speaking the truth. And that's what communicates. And I think people, from my frustration sometimes, people do keep surprising me that shallowness only sells for so long. And what resonates is this effort to tell the truth. And people know. Anyhow, some questions from the, see if we have some questions here before we wrap up. I know there's one. From Facebook, Saturday night music is completely non-compulsory. People opt out and they relish it as a real celebration, or they opt in fully and they relish it as real celebration. Can that happen on Sunday morning? Can Sunday morning even approximate the celebration of a Saturday night concert? That's a great question.
I'll ask.
Even if we had the Indigo Girls at Mass, would it work? I don't know.
yes, I think absolutely. I think when your spirit is moved by the word, by the music, that's the celebration, you know, singing those hymns with gusto. I grew up when we went to church at Emory, completely ecumenical experience, and I can still remember so many of the sermons. So it wasn't all like praise music, woohoo.
Okay, yeah.
Experience. And there is something you have to do a lot more careful listening. Music is sort of a vehicle for words, and a lot of our words talk about issues and so on. But in church, you know, you have to listen to the readings as well. It takes a little more patience. But overall, the experience of celebration and lifting your spirits. I remember leaving certain services and just feeling renewed, just renewed
Hmm.
by the sermon or by the music. And so to me, the answer is yes.
Well,
Well,
yeah, that's a good question. Whoever asked that, thank you, because it's my question. It's my whole life question. This is my vocational question. Can we get the church weaned away from its comfort and the fact that there are things going on in Scripture and in the sacraments that are so profound that we hardly can receive what's there? But that's the church's, I think, calling right now, in the midst of all the chaos, in the midst of all the death and destruction and injustice and oppression. Can the church hear again a prophetic word that is at the same time priestly? I mean, I know that's abstract, but what
say what you mean by that now.
a prophetic word is a word that challenges us to the world's wildfire, how to live into the world as God's people, and yet at the same time discover, as I think Emily has just said a little earlier today, that a prophetic word can be a healing word, a liberating word, a genuine start again filled with grace word. And that's what I'm looking for from the churches that I have connection with. And sometimes we're like people that have experienced it but haven't recognized what we've experienced.
Hmm.
And it's also the staying at it, show up, keep it going. Even when you have a flat EKG Sunday and nothing epiphs at all. Stay with it, for heaven's sake, stay with it, because there's some pretty smart cookies in the stories.
But Emily, you mentioned praise music, and there's a question here too from another viewer. The rise of contemporary praise music and its impact on the traditional parish. As an Episcopalian and a volunteer church musician, this is my weekly struggle. And maybe not to speak for this person, but I know working with students and liturgical musicians, at least here at St. John's, there's a worry that praise music has an initial appeal. I mean, I have to say, it kind of gets to me, but there's also a certain kind of thinness to it, perhaps. And it's a balance of giving people what they want so that they feel connected, and then also stretching. How do we do that musically, much less, theologically?
For me, it's thin ice when I get into. I don't want to judge anybody else's spiritual experience, but I think what I think is that praise music is just it's an immediate emotion. It's sort of like, it's very immediate, and it tastes really good and it feels really good, but it doesn't ask a lot of you, a lot of a person. And so I think good liturgical music asks more of the people who receive it. And that part of that, I think, is the way it's tied to the text or whatever the lyrics or words may be. Sometimes through the complexity of the music, whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
A lot of people have a beef with praise music, and I just think that it only goes so deep. I think that's the issue with it. And if that's your choice and you only want to go that deep, and I'm not going to judge that.
Yeah, very.
People who experience praise music go out into the world and it makes them do better things for other people in their communities, then
Right.
cool. But I personally need more than that.
Yeah, good for you. Don, do you have any comments on praise music?
Yeah, a lot. You don't want to hear. You don't want to hear. No, Emily said exactly what I would want to say, but I love her point. Music should ask questions of the hearers and the singers, and that's what I hear in a lot of your of the songs and the performance practices. So I asked the question of the church: does singing these songs, these hymns, these entrance songs, do they ask something of us? And I think until we questions, how long, O Lord? Are you there, O Lord? What is mercy? What is your loving kindness doing in this situation? Until we hear those questions, we'll sing the songs and we'll say, how nice of that. This is, I would pull a Kierkegaard story on Kohoi because he's a Kierkegaard guy, but it's like the deer park where everyone comes out of church and says, oh, wasn't that pleasant? Oh, that was so lovely. What was the text? And then the text was, with God, all things are possible. I mean, the sheer irony of our, having this deep reality and coming out of it and saying, oh, that was pleasant. Thank you very much. Yes.
How nice. Well, we have a talking about the text should ask something of us, and beyond asking of you both for this hour, which is wonderful, we have another request. And person says, remembering your beautiful wife and Mother Jane, can you send us out with melody during this All Saints and All Souls week that she loved, or you would encourage us? But is there something, a couple minutes of song from the two of you? We've had a lot of words.
Oh my goodness. Well,
In the Bleak Midwinter
I
was her
thought
favorite hymn.
her favorite Christmas hymn.
If you start a melody, maybe I can find a
Okay,
harmony for
all
the
right.
first.
I
Never
could
said it.
read the hymnal, but in the bleak midwinter, frosty wind may blow, first and hard as iron, earth is like a stone, and then
Snow
had fallen, snow on snow, snow on snow, in the bleak midwinter, long ago. What
That's
shall I
beautiful. Just
do in my heart?
beautiful. A great way to end. Thank you so much for an hour of wisdom and pleasure and calling us out, just as you said the music and the liturgy should do.
Having
Couldn't
us.
be more wonderful. Thank you. And
We-
Carla Duran, come back.
We thank God for the Collegeville Institute
Yeah,
and its ongoing,
Amen.
and the monastic community there, both women and men.
Well, oh my, what an edifying hour. Thank you so much. And thank you, Bill, for moderating, and Don and Emily, we just appreciate your sharing with us today. It was so wonderful. What a beautiful conversation.
thank you.
And thanks to all of you who have joined us online today. And we invite you to join us for future Collegeville Connections events. Please watch for information on our website and social media platforms, along with the registration details. Next month, on Wednesday, December 1st, same time, noon to 1 o'clock Central Time, you'll have the opportunity to hear from Christina Broadway-Bauman. Chris is the senior minister of the First Congregational United Church of Christ in Boulder, Colorado. And Chris will be presenting for us A Pilgrim's Calling, Walking Through Advent. So we hope you can join us that day as a way to begin your Advent season. And again, thanks to all of you for joining us today.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Mercy and grace.
Thank you.